Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be, Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So before Graham comes to preach, let's just pray. Father God, we thank you for your word, for the examples and the experiences that it contains of the lives of real people putting their trust in you. And Lord, as Graham comes to speak to us this morning, we ask that you will inspire him, that you have inspired him with his preparations, but that the Spirit will take his words and speak into our hearts this morning. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you, bright and early. Isn't it a lovely morning? But it's not going to be so good later. So you're very lucky to have got up early and enjoyed the sunshine. This isn't moving on. Why isn't this moving on? Anyhow, let's start, see if Paul can get that to go. We all love stories, don't we? It's wonderful to hear stories, especially when they are true stories. And of course, Jesus himself, the great teacher, often taught through stories. And we remember many of his stories, and we learn so much from them. Today, we begin the story of Ruth. It's a lovely story. Thank you very much. Although it's a story that has immense sadness within it, a story with immense sadness. I want you to see, just to see, as we begin this story of Ruth today, that it's a story, within a bigger story, that points to another story. Let's start, though, with the story of Ruth, just to give you a picture of what happened. We might say it's a story of Ruth. The book is called Ruth. As much as anything, though, at the beginning, it's the story of Naomi. Naomi and her husband Elimelech lived in Bethlehem, had 2 sons, but then there was a famine. And they left Bethlehem and moved to Moab. Moab was a nearby country, and they heard there was food there, so they went to live there, they settled there. Elimelech died. The 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, got married to 2 girls from Moab, Orpah and Ruth. But then sadly, Mahlon and Chilion died. And so here's Naomi left alone, but with her daughter-in-laws. After a while, and we're not sure, it says 10 years, we don't know whether that's 10 years from the beginning of the story or after her sons died, but after 10 years, she hears that there's food in Bethlehem, the famine is over, and so she decides to go home. And that's a story. But her daughter-in-laws say they will come with her. And that she has this discussion with them. Shall they come or shall they stay? She says, no, go back. They said, no, we'll come. She said, no, go back. Orpah goes back, but Ruth says, no, I'm going to go with you. And she goes back to Naomi. And the rest of the book is about what happens when they get back to Bethlehem. In fact, David Burnett, who is in our life group, is not only an expert in material science and anthropology and theology, he's an artist. And he's painted this story of Ruth arriving back at Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi. And I'm going to read the story because it gives you a sense of what it was like for these people to be returning. The old man settled himself under the shade of a tree near where the harvesters had begun working in the field that morning. He was too old to do all the bending and lifting that was needed to gather the barley, but he liked to be there to hear the chatter of the workers on the first day of the barley harvest. It all brought back so many memories. This is the old man's account of Naomi's return. I sat under the tree looking into the distance. My eyesight is now not good, but I could see about half a mile away travelers passing along the highway from Hebron in the south to Jerusalem in the north. The little shapes moved along the ridge of the hills along which the road ran. Then I noticed that the 3 of the shapes turned off the main road and started moving towards Bethlehem. As I wondered who they could be, I started thinking of those who'd left the village during the famine. Those were difficult years, and some older people had died. Many of those had left returned, but not Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 boys. They'd said they were going to Moab, some 50 or 60 miles to the east across the valley. That must now be over 10 years ago. As they got closer, I could see that these 2 women were with a donkey. They looked as if they had come a long way. The first was a young woman, upright, leading the donkey, while the other seemed stooped and older. Stranger, the older woman reminded me of Naomi. As I got nearer, I was sure it was Naomi. I got up from my seat and called to the workers near me, "It's Naomi." The woman looked and asked, "Can this be Naomi?" As the 2 women approached, more of the workers gathered to see who it was coming. "It is Naomi," they cried out. Naomi burst into tears. "Don't call me pleasant," she told them. That's what Naomi means. "Call me bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." We all felt deeply sorry for her as she told her story. By that time, all the workers had gathered around. All the time, her young companion stood back. She was a Moabitess, her daughter-in-law. She seemed fearful of how we would accept her. Israelites don't like Moabites, And it was forbidden to give your daughter as a wife to a Moabite man, because when our people had arrived at the Jordan to cross into the promised land, their king summoned Balaam the prophet to curse us. When that failed, some of their young women on their way to the high places encouraged some of our young men to go with them and sin. They were punished for that. After Naomi had said how kind Ruth had been to her, we all felt less suspicious of her. Then Naomi told us that she was about to leave. Ruth had held on to her and insisted, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." We were all impressed that she did not choose to go back to her family and worship their Moabite gods. We escorted Naomi and Ruth to Naomi's old house, which had remained empty all these years. The women helped tidy the place, brought them some food, and left them there to rest after the journey that had taken them about 7 days. You can imagine how this was all a matter of local chatter for many days to come. The women were all interested in Naomi's story and kept a close eye on Ruth to see what sort of person she was. That's a little bit of the background as it might have been when Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem. Now, in fact, Moab actually wasn't very far from Bethlehem in today's time. It's 50, 60 miles. But I guess to walk from there would take much longer to fly today from Beijing or Nairobi or South America. You know, it was a long way, and it was a different place. It was quite a journey. And the cross-cultural move was very significant. And this emigration, if you like, this moving from one country, one culture to another and back again, was a very significant part of this story for Naomi and indeed for Ruth. And of course, there's a lot of us here in this church who have moved from one culture to another, from one country to another. And sometimes that's become a very significant part of our life and our story. And so, as we work through the story of Ruth today and in the next few weeks, I hope we'll want to think about what our story is and how God is working in our lives. Now, the story of Ruth, as I said, is a story within a story within a story that points to another story. It's the story of Ruth or maybe the story of Naomi. It begins by saying it's in the time when the judges ruled. Now, that was a period from about 1300 to 1000 BC. It's written about in the book of Judges, which is immediately before Ruth in the Bible. And it was a terrible time. It was a time of chaos. It was a time of all sorts of treachery. It was a time of unfaithfulness to God, of disaster, of recovery, of disaster. And it ends with these very sad words. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And it was a chaotic scene. There's some grim stories in Judges. And I think that expression, there was no king, comes at least 4 times in the book of Judges. What it's saying is, it was no order, there was chaos. It was an unruly, dangerous, disordered place. Now, the story of Ruth occurs within that period. And I find that in itself is encouraging, that in a period of chaos, when everything seems to be falling apart, yet God is still working in people's lives and great things can happen. And you know, that may be a message for some of us here today, when we feel everything around us is in chaos, yet God can work and does work in our lives to bless us. And so in a sense, the story of Ruth is a sub-story in the story of Judges. And yet the story of Judges is a sub-story in the bigger story of the Bible, what I call the big story of the Bible, that starts with creation and the fall, and then the rest of the Bible is how God is restoring his people to himself. That work of redemption, restoration, renewal. And it's part of that story. And we'll see in particular how Ruth fits into that story. And then I think too it points to another story, the story of Jesus, who is the true Redeemer. Now, I really got 2 points I want to make as we look at the first chapter of Ruth this morning. And the first is this. There are signs of hope throughout this chapter. You know, in the first 5 verses, there is incredible sadness. You know, we can read those quickly and get onto the rest of the story about Ruth. But think of the sadness that happens there. Firstly, it's the time of the judges. And that was a bad, grim, difficult time for the history of Israel. A time of selfishness and chaos. Secondly, it starts with a famine. You know, and people were suffering. As David told the story, maybe some of the people died because of famine. Interestingly, that famine occurred in Bethlehem. Anybody knows what the word Bethlehem means? It's a house of bread. So this was a place where there should be food, it's a house of bread, and yet there was famine. This is disaster, this is difficulty. And so they go to Moab, but there Elimelech dies. He goes to find life, but actually he dies. And if that's not enough, Naomi's 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they also die. You know, what grief there is there. You know, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this is a sort of world we live in. And that's why the big story of the Bible makes sense, because it explains why there is a fallen world. It is not the world as God intended, but sin came in and rebellion came in, and sin brought death and disaster and sadness. And yet, the story of Ruth is part of that big story, how God is redeeming people back to himself and bringing hope. And so in the story, I want us to look at 5 things that point to hope. Certainly to hope for Naomi and Ruth, but hope for us and hope for the world. The first thing that's interesting about the book of Ruth is the names. The names are all interesting. We've already seen Bethlehem, it's a house of bread, and yet there was famine there. The name of the father in the family was Elimelech, and Elimelech means God is king. Isn't that interesting? Just the verse before in the Bible, the last verse in the book of Judges, said there was no king in the land, but then this story starts with someone whose name is God is king. See what it's saying? That we might think there's no king, we might think there's no order, we might think it's all chaotic, but actually God is king. And he always is. You remember reading the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar, that great king, had to learn that it is the Most High that rules in the kingdom of men. God is still on the throne. As we turn to the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, we see heaven opened and we see a throne and we see the Lamb, Jesus, sitting on the throne. And so ultimately, in this story, we're reminded right from the beginning that although it's a scene of disaster and chaos, yet God is still king. God is sorting things out. Actually, looking forward to the end of the book, and I'm giving you a preview of what happens in 3 weeks' time, we find that Ruth eventually becomes a mother, and actually she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Now, of course, King David was the great king of the Bible, the greatest king of Israel, and he foreshadows another king, David's greater son, Jesus, who is coming, who is the King of Kings, who is going to rule the world. So you see again what's happening here. We start with where there was no king in the land, and yet actually through the story of Ruth, we see the story of the bloodline of David, who is going to be the great king. And that's that reminder that God is actually doing something, and doing something through this sadness and sorrow to establish his king. And of course, the world will ultimately be blessed when we find that Jesus is king. The third thing is this, is that prayer is answered. We find that Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. Because obviously the people back there in Judah had been praying, and God had heard their prayer and answered their prayer. And there was bread again restored to the house of bread. And there is hope. And, the sufferings that we suffer in this life are limited. And ultimately, God will hear our cry. So keep crying out to God. If you're going through a time of famine and sadness, keep crying out to God, and he will hear you. The fourth sign of encouragement is about Ruth herself. You see, Ruth was a Moabitess, and we've heard how the Moabites were kind of enemies of Israel. And I guess if you'd asked anybody in Israel, could anybody in Moab come into God's blessing, they'd say, no, they're dreadful people. They're lost. Remember what they did to our ancestors. And of course, as we read the Old Testament, Israel had a particular place as the people of God. And they often thought that, some of them must have thought that there was no blessing, no hope for people outside that. And yet God's ultimate plan was that people from every tribe and nation, every nation of the world would be blessed. And of course, that we will be blessed through Jesus. And, I often see the story of redemption is bookended by the call of Abraham. God calls Abram and said, through you and your descendant, all nations will be blessed. And it ends in Revelation, where we see before the throne of God people from every tribe and language and nation blessed before God. And it's great to see that people like Ruth, who might have seemed hopeless, outside the place of blessing, outside the nation of blessing, outside the knowledge of God, was called by God and came not only to be blessed by God, but to be playing such a key role, actually of one who was a human ancestor to Jesus. Signs of hope. And the final one, sign of hope, is the personal hope for Naomi. The personal hope for Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. And yet when she came back home, she said, don't call me pleasant. Call me bitterness. Mara, it means bitterness, because the Lord's inflicted me with bitterness. And yet she is blessed. And she does return home. And she has a wonderful daughter-in-law. And in the end, when Obed is born, again, this is in chapter 4, the people say, Naomi has a son. She's blessed. The women said to Naomi, this is chapter 4, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, have given him birth. Now, this story of Naomi is the big one, isn't it? I guess there may be people here who feel like Naomi, who feel their life hasn't been pleasant, that actually their life has been bitter because of things that have gone wrong. And sadly, we sometimes wonder why it is that some people seem to suffer loss after loss and sadness after sadness. And there are no easy answers. There are no quick fixes. You see, note that even after all these, we might think good things happened to Naomi. She'd got this wonderful daughter-in-law. The famine had gone. She was back home in Bethlehem. But still at that point, she said, don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. She felt things deeply, and things had been bad. And yet, we will see through this story that Naomi is encouraged and blessed and provided for and sees the goodness of God. There are these signs of hope in the chapter, and there is hope for you, whatever you feel. Our hope is in Jesus. I think preaching here a while ago, I told the story of someone who said that hope has a name, and the name is Jesus. And of course, our hope is in Jesus. Praise be to God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, nor fade. The inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power, until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. Hope has a name. The name is Jesus. And so there is hope. And sometimes we don't know what to do, like the Israelites we read about in 2 Chronicles. They don't know what to do, they said. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And sometimes we just have to put our eyes on Jesus, knowing that ultimately he is good and he will bring us through. But then the other thing I want us to bring from this is the story of Ruth's life. You know, God has a story for our lives, and yet there's a sense in which we need to write ourselves into it. And this is what Ruth did. The decision of Ruth to return home with Naomi is very much the center of this chapter. All that stuff about what happened to Elimelech and his family is over in 5 verses, and the rest of the chapter really is about Ruth and her decision to go back with Naomi. And we see this tremendous expression of commitment. You know, when there's been this backwards and forwards, we'll come with you. No, you go home to your family. No, we'll come with you. And Orpah says, yes, I will go back to my family, and that's an understandable thing to do. But Ruth says no. She said, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. That's some commitment, isn't it? Especially to your mother-in-law. Why? Was it love and respect for Naomi? Maybe was it clinging on to the memories of her husband Kilian, and maybe going back would keep that alive? Or maybe it was, and I like to think it was, because she'd come to learn and believe that the God of her mother-in-law, Naomi, was a living God and the true God and the Savior God and the faithful God. And she wanted to be part of that blessing. You know, in a sense, her emigration from Moab to Israel, to Judah, wasn't the main thing. The main thing, I believe, was that she came to acknowledge the living God and come into his blessing. And what a commitment that was. And that's the sort of commitment that Jesus asks of us, that the Lord asks of us. If we want to be part of his story of blessing, if we want to be written into his story for our lives, then we need to make that commitment to follow him and for him to be our God. Ruth's decision to go back with Naomi was really the center of the chapter. In a sense, the center of our service here this morning is whether or not you will go with Jesus and you will follow him and accept him as your Savior and Lord. You know, you may or may not be one of those who's moved around the world. That doesn't, in a sense, matter. But if you want to enjoy the blessings of God and be part of his story of recovery and restoration and renewal, you need to come to Jesus. And that opportunity is yours this morning. Now, I thought it would be good to hear from somebody who has actually moved from one country to another, and actually God used that as part of his journey for faith. So Frank is going to come and just tell us his story.
My name is Frank. I was born and grown up in China. I was educated as an atheist since I was a little child. I went to uni in Shanghai and worked as a civil servant for 5 years in Beijing before I came to do a master's course in Reading University many years ago. When I first arrived at Reading, I bought a second-hand bike and rode it on the right-hand side of the road as I did in China. Once I was riding uphill in the Eastern Avenue, to my surprise, an oncoming lorry stopped in front of me, and the driver came out of the lorry and told me loudly, "It is dangerous!" So I pushed my bike to the pavement to avoid the embarrassment and shock. As part of the New Students Welcome program, the university took us to visit Windsor Castle and dropped us off in the front car park of Wycliffe Church on the way back, and saying that we were all invited by the international friends to have tea in Wycliffe Church. I was reluctant to go into the church because I was taught that religion is a spiritual opium. But all the students entered the church, and I felt very awkward to be the only one who not joined in this group. So I thought that I can't be controlled or addicted to a cup of tea. But my English was not very good, so I didn't realize that the afternoon tea in England was a very good dinner. And I met many Wycliffe Church members, people, during that tea, and found that they are very hospitable, friendly, generous. As in the Ruth story, food is important. And in China, we only give food to friends, not to people we don't know. But the church people were not evil as I was taught. Not at all. That was my first experience of church, and that was a very good one. When I was finishing my dissertation, which is a very difficult task for me, the landlord and his builders kicked us out of the accommodation before the end of the contract and detained one of my housemates' luggage, demanding £1,500 to return it. We couldn't get any help from the Chinese embassy, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, which is founded by the Chinese embassy, or the local police. The student stayed in the police station over the night as he didn't have anywhere to go, and he couldn't get his books, his food, his clothes back. The next day, Phil Holder, a member of this church, heard of this case, and he actually didn't know that Chinese student at all. However, he took us to the police station, and we couldn't get any luck, and later on he got a solicitor for us to help us. The landlord was so cunning that both the police and the solicitor couldn't help us to get the luggage back for that student. But Elaine Holmes, another member of Wycliffe Church, helped this student eventually to get their luggage back. I was convinced that these Christians were the best people in the world, and I wanted to become one like them. So after I expressed my view, Phil Holder introduced Jesus to me. After becoming a Christian in this foreign land, thousands of miles away from Beijing, I have experienced God's mercy, forgiveness, grace, and love far beyond my imagination. I'm very grateful to God and have been eager to share gospel to other people. And Jesus is a hope, our human being. Thank you.